Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to look into API endpoints in more detail. Specifically, we're going to delve into the request object and see all the different ways that we can actually send data to our API endpoint using the request object. First of all, let's start with a quick recap of what we did in our last video. We created a very basic server.js file to start our node server. We used Express to make an app, and then we listened on the particular port that we had defined to get our server up and running. We also created a basic API endpoint, and we sent a GET request to this endpoint using ThunderClient right here, and we were actually able to see our text response that we got back. So we basically saw that API endpoints are a way for us to interact with our server. It's a way for people to send requests to our server and get something back in response. Today, we're going to look at all the different types of ways we can send data through this very request object right here. And we're also going to see the different types of responses that we can send back through our server. Let's start off with our request object. There's four different main ways that I'm going to show you in this video to send data to our API endpoint using the request object. These are going to be parameters, query parameters, the request body, and request headers. If you don't understand what this means, don't worry, we're going to walk through them one by one. First of all, let's start with request parameters. Now, we define URLs up here for our API endpoints. And what we can do is that we can actually include parameters inside these URLs. So this is basically going to be part of our route pattern. I'm going to show you how we can do this with a simple example. So I'm writing another endpoint right here, and I'm going to write a special syntax in here. I'm going to explain this in just a minute. So as you can see, the second part is pretty similar to what we wrote up above. We defined a simple arrow function. So we're saying that when a get request is sent to this endpoint, we want to call this function. But what exactly is in this endpoint? We included right here next to this slash, we have colon and then ID. And what this does is that it's defining a parameter named ID inside our route. Now, how would this look like inside our function? Well, we can actually access the value of this ID parameter by writing something like this. Let's have an item ID and let's name it, we can access it like this. So I said that from the request object, we can actually get the ID in this way, and we're storing it inside another variable called item ID. Now, the name that we used here actually depends on what we used up here. So if I change this to something like item ID, then I would need to access it using the item ID keyword as well. So for now, let's just keep it as ID and see how this would work. So this is how we'll access item ID. We can see what the item ID was sent just by console logging it. So let's say item ID sent was, and then let's just add the item ID right here. And then in the response, we can just send something like receive the ID. Okay, so this is pretty simple and straightforward. Let's just see how we can actually send this ID up in ThunderClient. So let's open ThunderClient right here, send a new request, and of course we're going to make it a get request because that's what we define here. So it's a get request, and we're going to send it to localhost 3000, which is our base URL. And after that, we need to add this, right? So we're going to write items slash, and now comes the ID, right? So let's just say, for example, 1. So this is the ID that we're sending here. This is the parameter, that's 1. Let's send the request. Okay, I forgot to start the server. Let's just start our server, server.js. Now the server is listening. Let's send the request again. And there we go. So we have the response here. And if you look right here in our console, we actually have the console logging out the ID that we sent. Now, if we change it to something else, for example, let's just type a string. I just type in ABC. We can see that it changes to ABC. So this is how we can access parameters from our request. Next up, we have query parameters. Now, you might be wondering what the difference between query parameters and parameters is. And we'll basically see what problem query parameters solve. Now, if you think about it, suppose we had to search for items and we had to include, for example, the number of items we want, what order we want them to be sorted by, or what category we want them to be. If we had to define parameters for such a request, to send such a request, we would have to define something like this. We'd have to have items, and then maybe we would have ID, and then maybe sort order, and then maybe you would have number of items. This would be very lengthy and very tricky to remember exactly what order these would be in, because the first one would always be ID, the second one would always be sort order. This is what the order would be expected to be, because we're defining it as part of the route itself, as part of the route pattern. So this is not feasible for such requests. In that case, we're actually going to use query parameters. Now let's define something like an endpoint, like a search endpoint in our server, and we're going to add a similar request and response arrow function, which should be pretty familiar by now. And in this, we're going to send query parameters. How are we going to do that? So we can do it using something like ThunderClient. So I'm going to go ahead into ThunderClient, create a new request, and over here, if I look at what I actually define here, I just defined a simple search endpoint. So I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to send a request similarly to our search endpoint. And now instead of defining our parameter up here in the URL, I'm going to use the tab provided to us by ThunderClient. And here I'm going to write, so basically the query parameters are going to be key value pairs. We have the parameter name and its value. So let's say we're going to search an item by its name. Let's say item name, and we want it to be, for example, laptop, right? And maybe we want to define another parameter. Let's say we have our price. So we want to define a price range, right? So let's say we want the price to be, let's say, max price is 200. Okay, so we don't want something that's going to be higher than this, right? So we're sending a kind of, more sophisticated request. Now, if we look up here in our URL, we can see that the URL has actually changed. It has actually added these things right here, but it's not because we made it. We didn't actually write this ourselves. It added it on its own, and it has a specific syntax to it if you look at it. Now, how would we access these parameters inside our server, inside our endpoint? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Um, there's a simple syntax for it, and that would be something like, for example, we could define a const, a variable. We could define item name. And how would we get it? We would say rec.query dot and then the name of our query parameter, which was in this case item name. So we defined it as item name right here, and we're actually getting it and storing it in this variable. With this variable can be named anything you want. It doesn't have to be the same name. Let's say, for example, price or max price, right? So our max price would be rec.query.max price. And now we can just console log this out right here. We're not actually doing anything with this data for now. We will in the future, but we're just showing you how to access these query parameters, right? So we'd say item requested was, that was whatever the name of the item was. And then you can say max price should be, and let's add our max price. All right. Okay. So now, and let's just send a response back as well. As we don't want to leave our request hanging. We must send a response back. So let's just say, got your request. Okay, let's send a request. Let's send this request and see what happens. Let's make sure our server is running first. And there we go. Okay, so we can see that we actually got these values right here inside our server, and we can actually manipulate them, use them to send a request to our database, and all of those exciting things we're going to look into in the future. But this is how you use query parameters, and of course these are flexible. They don't have to be in the same order. I can actually remove this from here. I can remove this using this cross button and add the item name later. As long as I just keep this name the same as whatever I'm using it to access here, there is no issue. So I can just send it again, and you can see it still works. The order doesn't matter. In fact, if I remove this altogether, it's still going to work. It's going to be undefined. It's going to have some undefined behavior. So it didn't actually find the item name, but it's not like it didn't work. The request actually did send the response back. Now, if you didn't already catch on, this is actually something that's really useful. The fact that it is actually telling us whether or not that a particular query parameter was given or not. And we can actually use this here. So for example, let's say if rec.query dot item name, and this means if there's a truthy value, if it's not undefined or if it's not some unexpected value, we can actually just use this. So we can say you provided an item name. And then else, if it's a falsy value, we can print a different message. All right, so let's see how this would work. We need to close our server and start it again. And now we can see we started our server again. Let's send that request again. So we can see we didn't actually include any item name parameter here, and it says no item name was provided. So this is really useful because we can use this if we have some optional field, or if we have some, we can include any different combination of query parameters here, and all we have to do is just check if they have been passed, we can use them. We can use them to construct a more complex query, send queries to our database, and if they're not provided, we can act accordingly. So for now, we're just doing simple console logs because we're focusing on the actual request object. But in the future, we'll see how these are more useful as we get connected to our database. The next thing that we're going to discuss is the request body. Now, so far, we've only looked at GET requests. In the GET requests, we have two ways of sending the data, which is the parameters and the query parameters. Now we're going to discuss a new type of request, which is the POST request. When we're using the POST request, it's usually when we want to send some kind of data to the server and actually have some change happen in the backend. So as the name suggests, the GET request is usually just to fetch some data. It doesn't actually change any data on the backend. And a POST request would usually expect you to, for example, add a new user, add a new item, or perform some kind of operation on the database, which actually changes the values on the backend. Let's see an example of a simple POST request. We can, for example, post to item, and this would suggest that we're trying to create a new item in our database. We're not actually going to do this for now. We're just going to see how the data is being passed, just to have our information broken down into bits so it's easier to understand. Now, when we're posting to this endpoint, we're basically saying that a request of type post is going to come on this endpoint, and this is what we want to do with it. So for example, maybe we want to just print out the information for now that's being sent for the item. How would we send a post request to this endpoint? Let's go back into ThunderClient, create a new request, and over here we're going to use um, the same localhost 3000 base URL, of course, and then we're going to add item, which is the URL that we defined just now, and we want to send a post request. So let's change the type from here and make it a post request. Now, how do we send data in the request body? Well, if you look up here, we actually have the option to go to this body tab and add a request body right here inside, and we can use different types of data, but for now we're just going to stick to JSON. So let's, for example, create a JSON object right here, give it some properties. Let's give it an item name property, new item, and then let's have, for example, item price, and we can have maybe, so we have defined a little JSON object right here inside our request body. Now, how would we access this item inside our API endpoint right here? Well, all we have to do is first we need to actually make sure that our app can parse the JSON. And for that, we have a pretty simple command in Express which we can use. We're going to write an app.use, and then let's call the JSON function from Express, which would be express.json. And this is going to allow us to actually parse JSON data inside our application. Now, back inside our request body, for example, let's get the object that we have defined in our request body by doing something like this: const item equals rec.body. Now, this should give us the JSON object that we're sending here inside our request body. Now we do actually want to do something with this item that we're getting from the request body. So I'm just going to console log it for now. In the future, we will see how to actually add this item to our database. For now, we're just looking at how the request object works. Let's also send back a response. And that's all. And of course, we would like to restart our server since we made some changes here. So we're going to do node server.js, restart the server. And now let's send this request. So it does send the response, got the item. And if we look in our console, it actually logged out the item as a JSON object. One of the main advantages of this that you can clearly see is that the data that we're sending isn't actually being included inside the URL, which makes it much safer because our data isn't exposed inside the URL. And of course, we can structure complex JSON objects and we can do nesting. We can send arrays, we can send different data types inside a single JSON object, which is going to be really useful. The last thing we're going to discuss today are request headers. And request headers are usually a very important part of any HTTP request because they provide additional information about the request. For example, the type of content that is being sent. It's also used to send authentication credentials such as a token and other such important information. So, let's see how we can send and receive request headers inside an API endpoint. For example, suppose we want to get some sensitive information that is only accessible to our admin. How would we do that? So let's define an endpoint. And suppose this is an endpoint that is supposed to send back some sensitive data. And we want to check whether or not the person sending the request is authorized or not. How would we do that? Now, such sensitive information should only be sent in the request headers. And by sensitive information, I mean the information about who the user actually is. We shouldn't send it in the JSON or in the URL. So if we want to send this in the form of a header, all we have to do is first, let's open up ThunderClient once again and create a new request. And again, we're sending a GET request to 3000 localhost 3000, our base URL, and let's write sensitive data. And now, sensitive data, okay. And now we want to add inside our headers. Let's go over to headers right here. We already have some headers added here by default. Let's add an authorization header. So we can see there are some, names coming up here. I'm just going to select authorization. And let's write, for example, usually this would include the token, right? We're going to look into what tokens are in one of the future videos, but for now, let's just add something like this, okay? So this is going to be the value. Again, this is a key value pair, the header and the value. And right now, the authorization header has a value of I am admin. All right, let's go back into our server and see how we can access this header. So let's save it in another const variable, and let's say, let's save it in the auth, and then let's write rec.headers. And now we need to add inside square brackets the name of our header. So that would be authorization. And let's see what value we get here. Let's just console log that out. And let's just return a response for now. Let's see what this does. So we would like to close our server, run it again to reflect the changes. And let's go ahead and send this request. So for now, we can see we're console logging this header out here. Maybe we want to do something here. So let's, for example, let's say if the token or the authorization that we've sent here, if it is equal to admin one, then we want to send a different response. Let's send you're authorized. And else we can send a different response, which could be you're not authorized. So basically, we're checking the information sent inside the header right here. We're saving it inside the auth const, and we're checking it if it's according to what we want it to be. We can send a different response. Otherwise, we can send something different. Of course, you can do this in any endpoint. I'm just doing it to demonstrate the purpose of an authorization header. Let's close our server, start it again. and send our request. And it says you're authorized. Now, what if I change the value of this token? Let's, for example, say I'm a user or anything else. It says you're not authorized. So this is really useful because we can check who the user is, or for example, this user agent header would tell us where the request is actually coming from. So it would reflect, for example, the device or the software that the request is coming from. And there are other headers, for example, content type, which would retrieve the type of content that's being sent inside our request. So this is how headers work, and this is the syntax that we can use to access them. And stay tuned for the next video in which we're going to explore the response object and see how we can actually use this object to send different types of responses back to the client, just like we use different types of requests just now in this video. And we're also going to look more into how we can actually utilize the request object to manipulate our database in one of the future videos as well. So stay tuned and happy coding.